My name is Ivy Colton, and the night everything changed started at 2:04 a.m. with a phone call I almost didn't answer. I remember staring at the screen for a second, half awake, trying to decide if it was worth it, because nobody calls you at that hour with good news. It wasn't my mom. It wasn't my dad. It was a number I didn't recognize, and something in my chest tightened before I even picked up. I answered anyway, voice dry, barely there. And a woman I hadn't spoken to in years said my name, like she'd been holding on to it for a while. "Ivy, honey, it's Ruth's neighbor. Your grandmother collapsed. The ambulance just took her." That was it. No soft lead-in, no easing into it, just a straight drop. I was already out of bed before she finished talking, pulling on jeans, grabbing whatever was closest my hands, moving faster than my brain could keep up. I called my mom while I was tying my shoes. It rang long enough to make me think she wouldn't answer, and when she did, she sounded annoyed, like I'd interrupted something more important. I told her what happened, every word coming out too fast, and there was this pause on the other end that didn't feel like worry. It felt like calculation. Then she sighed and said, "She's old, Ivy. That's what happens. I have work in the morning. Call your sister." And then she hung up. No questions. No, is she okay? Just done. I stood there for a second, phone still in my hand, trying to process how someone hears that and reacts like it's a scheduling issue. I called my sister next, and she picked up faster, but it didn't go much better. She had bar prep. She couldn't leave. She didn't know what I expected her to do from where she was. I didn't argue. I didn't have time. I grabbed my keys and drove 4 hours in the dark with nothing but the highway and the sound of my own breathing. And if you've ever driven that far at that hour, you know how quiet it gets, how your thoughts start getting louder than they should. By the time I got to the hospital, my hands were shaking, and I didn't even realize it until I tried to sign in at the front desk. They sent me up to the ICU, and I walked into a room that smelled like disinfectant and something colder than that, something final. My grandmother was lying there with tubes in her arms and a mask over her face, and for a second I didn't recognize her, which is a strange thing to feel about someone who practically raised you. The left side of her body wasn't moving. Her eyes opened when I stepped closer, and she reached for my hand like it was the only thing she could still control. She squeezed once, just enough to let me know she was still in there, and she tried to say something through the mask. I leaned in close enough to hear it, and whatever she said stayed with me, but in that moment, what mattered more was everything she didn't say, everything she couldn't say anymore. A doctor came in a few minutes later and explained it in that calm, professional tone they use when the situation is anything but calm. Stroke. Significant damage. Recovery would take months, maybe longer. She'd need help with everything. Eating, bathing, moving, full-time care. He said it like he was reading off a list, like this was just another Tuesday for him, and I nodded like I understood. Even though all I could think was that there was no one else here. Not my mom, not my sister. Just me standing there trying to figure out how my life had shifted this much in a single night. The social worker handed me a packet about home care options, and I flipped through it out of habit, like maybe there'd be a simple answer buried somewhere in the fine print. There wasn't. $40 an hour minimum. Insurance barely covered anything. My grandmother's Social Security check wasn't even close. I did the math in my head because that's what I do when things don't make sense and the numbers didn't work no matter how I rearranged them. I went back to the room and sat next to her bed, holding her hand, listening to the machines, and I realized something that nobody had said out loud but was obvious anyway. If I walked away, there was no backup plan. There was no one stepping in behind me. This wasn't a shared responsibility. It was mine, whether I liked it or not. The next morning, I drove back to campus, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to make it official. I sat in my academic advisor's office, still wearing the same clothes from the night before, and told him I needed to take a leave of absence. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me to stay. He just looked at me for a second, like he understood more than I'd actually said, and then he pulled out the paperwork. "You've been doing well here," he said. "You can come back when you're ready." I nodded, even though I didn't know if when was ever going to happen. Signing that form felt heavier than it should have, like I was putting something on hold without any guarantee I'd ever pick it back up. I packed my dorm room into boxes that afternoon, every item suddenly feeling smaller than it had the day before, like it belonged to a different version of me. On the drive back to Bridgeport, I called my mom again to tell her what I'd decided. There was that same pause, that same quiet that didn't feel supportive. Then she said, "Don't tell anyone you're taking a leave. People don't need to know our business." I asked her what she wanted me to say instead, and she didn't hesitate. Just say you quit. It's simpler. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so clean, so easy for her to rewrite it into something that made more sense to her. I looked out at the road ahead, steady, endless, and I realized that this wasn't just about my grandmother anymore. This was about the version of me my family was willing to accept versus the reality I was actually living. I pulled into my grandmother's driveway a few hours later, got out of the car and stood there for a second before going inside, knowing that whatever came next, there wasn't going to be a clean way back to the life I had before that. Phone call. I walked in anyway. Set my bags down and got to work, because sometimes the biggest decisions don't feel like decisions at all. They feel like the only option left. I stood in my grandmother's kitchen with my phone still in my hand, watching her sleep in a rented hospital bed in the living room, and I made the mistake of thinking the hard part was over. It wasn't. The real problem started the second I told my mother what I'd decided. I called her that afternoon not for approval, just to inform her, because that's what normal people do when something serious happens. I said it plainly: no drama, no build-up. I'm taking a leave from school. Grandma needs full-time care. There was a pause on the line, but it wasn't the kind that comes from shock or concern. It was quiet in a way that felt measured, like she was already deciding how this would sound when she repeated it later. Then she said it calm, flat, like she was correcting a small detail. Don't tell anyone that. I thought I heard her wrong. What I don't want the family thinking we can't handle our own problems, she said. You know how people talk. I looked through the doorway at my grandmother, at the woman who had spent the last few months relearning how to move her own hand, and I tried to connect that reality with what my mother was worried about. It didn't line up. But that's what's happening, I said. She had a stroke. She needs help. My mother exhaled slowly, like I was the one making this complicated. The truth is, you're quitting school, Ivy. That's all anyone needs to know. And just like that, she reframed it. Not a choice. Not a sacrifice. Not a situation that required context. Just a failure. Clean, simple, easy to repeat over dinner. I felt something shift in that moment, not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet realization that we were not having the same conversation. I was talking about what actually happened. She was talking about how it would look. I wanted to argue. I wanted to push back and explain the difference between quitting and choosing, between giving up and stepping in. But I also knew exactly how that would go. I'd raise my voice, she'd lower hers, and somehow I'd still end up looking like the problem. So I didn't fight her. I said nothing, and that was all she needed. Silence is a blank page if you give it to the wrong person, and my mother had always been good at filling in the blanks. The first time I saw it play out was a few weeks later at a family barbecue. I almost didn't go, but my grandmother wanted to get out of the house. And I wasn't about to tell her no after everything she'd been through, so I pushed her wheelchair through the back gate, and I felt it immediately. The way conversations paused for half a second too long. The way people looked at me then, looked away like they didn't want to get caught staring. It wasn't subtle, but it wasn't direct either, which somehow made it worse. My aunt was the first to say something. She came over with that careful tone people use when they think they're being kind. "Are you okay?" She asked, her hand on my arm, like I might fall apart if she didn't steady me. "Your mom told us." That was the moment I knew exactly what version of the story had made its way around the table. I glanced across the yard and saw my mother standing by the drink, surrounded by relatives, dabbing her eyes with a napkin like she was the one going through something difficult. She looked up just long enough to catch me noticing, then looked back down like she couldn't bear to meet my eyes. It was a performance, and she knew I knew it, but that didn't matter because everyone else was buying it. "It's not exactly like that," I started to say, and I didn't even get to finish the sentence. "Ivy, please," my mother cut in from across the patio, her voice soft but carrying just enough to reach every corner. "Not here. Not today." Every head turned, and just like that, I was the one making a scene. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't said anything dramatic, but somehow I was the problem. I closed my mouth because I could feel it happening in real time. The shift from confusion to judgment, the way people decide who to believe based on tone instead of facts. My grandmother squeezed my wrist from her chair, a small, steady pressure that said more than words ever could. Let it go. Not because she agreed with my mother, but because she understood something I was still learning. You don't win an argument when the other person is controlling the audience. For the rest of that afternoon, I stood off to the side, holding a plate I never ate, from listening to conversations that circled around me without ever including me. My mother moved easily between groups, telling a version of events that made her look concerned, and me look like a disappointment she was trying to manage. She never said anything outright cruel. That wasn't her style. She didn't need to. She implied just enough, paused in the right places, let other people fill in the worst conclusions on their own. It was efficient, I'll give her that. By the time we left, the story had settled into something solid. I was the one who couldn't handle school. I was the one who gave up. I was the one everyone felt quietly sorry for. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with a message from my sister. "Mom's really upset," it read. "Why do you always have to make everything about yourself?" I read it once, then again, trying to find the part where I'd done anything at all. Then I locked my phone and put it away, because I was starting to understand that this wasn't about what I did. It was about what my mother said I did, and those were two very different things. Over the next few months, the pattern repeated itself so consistently, it almost became predictable. Every gathering, every call, every offhand comment from a relative carried the same underlying assumption. They weren't asking what happened. They already knew, or at least they thought they did. And every time I considered correcting them, I could hear my mother's voice in my head, calm and certain, telling me exactly how that would look. Defensive, emotional, unstable. She didn't just tell a story. She built a framework around it, one that made any contradiction seem like proof that she was right. That's the part people don't talk about when it comes to manipulation. It's not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it's quiet, controlled, and incredibly consistent. It doesn't need to convince everyone. It just needs to be the first version people hear. After that, everything else sounds like an excuse. And the longer it went on, the harder it became to push back, because I wasn't just correcting a single misunderstanding. I was challenging a narrative that had already been repeated enough times to feel like truth. My mother didn't need to argue with me. She'd already spoken for me. I pushed my grandmother's wheelchair through the back gate and felt the shift before anyone said a word, like I'd walked into a room where everyone had already agreed on something about me and just forgot to tell me what it was. The 4th of July barbecue at my aunt's house used to be loud in a good way. Kids running through sprinklers, someone burning burgers, music that was a little too loud. But that year the noise had this strange edge to it, like people were talking around me instead of to me. We were late because I'd spent the afternoon helping my grandmother through her physical therapy routine, the kind that makes you realize how many small things you take for granted until you have to relearn them one at a time. By the time we arrived, most people were already settled in drinks in hand plates, half-full conversations in progress. I smiled, said hi to a few people, kept it normal, because that's what you do when you walk into a situation you don't fully understand yet. But the look started almost immediately. Not open hostility, nothing that obvious. It was subtler than that. People would meet my eyes for a second too long, then look away like they'd just remembered something uncomfortable. A couple of my cousins gave me that tight, polite smile people use when they don't know what to say but feel like they should say something. It would have been easier if someone had just come up to me and asked directly, but nobody did. They didn't need to. My mother had already done the talking. My aunt was the first one to approach me, hand on my arm, voice soft in that careful, sympathetic way that instantly made my stomach drop. "Honey, are you okay?" she asked. "Your mom told us." That sentence carried more weight than anything she actually said after it, because it told me exactly what version of the story had made its way around the yard. I glanced over toward the drink table and saw my mother standing there with a small group of relatives. Her shoulders slightly hunched, her expression just sad enough to look convincing without being dramatic. She dabbed at her eyes with a napkin like she was holding it together for everyone else's sake. It would have been impressive if it wasn't so calculated. "It's not really like that," I said, keeping my voice even because I wasn't about to fall into the trap of sounding defensive. I didn't even get to finish. "Ivy, please," my mother called out. From across the yard, her voice soft, but somehow loud enough to carry over everything else. "Not here, not today." It was a perfect line. Calm, controlled, just emotional enough to make her look reasonable and me look like I was about to cause a scene. And just like that, the attention shifted, heads turned, conversations paused. It didn't matter that I hadn't raised my voice or said anything dramatic. The implication was enough. I was the problem. Again, I closed my mouth not because I agreed with her, but because I could see exactly how this would play out if I didn't. I'd try to explain, she'd get emotional, and suddenly I'd be the one making her upset in front of everyone. It was a losing game, and she'd been playing it longer than I had. My grandmother reached up from her wheelchair and squeezed my wrist, a small, steady reminder that I didn't need to fight every battle in real time, so I let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because I understood something I hadn't fully accepted before. The story had already been told. Everything I said now would just sound like an excuse. For the rest of the afternoon, I stayed near the edge of things, close enough to be present, but not enough to be part of anything. I picked up a plate out of habit, added food I didn't plan to eat, and stood off to the side while conversations moved around me like I wasn't quite in the same space. I heard pieces of it without trying. She left school right. Such a shame, she was doing so well. At least she's helping her grandmother, that's something. It wasn't cruel. That's what made it worse. Nobody was trying to hurt me. They just believed what they'd been told, and they were responding to it the way people do when they think they understand a situation. My mother moved through the crowd like she always did, stopping at different groups, repeating the same version of events with slight variations depending on who she was talking to. Concerned tone here, quiet sigh there, a small shake of her head at just the right moment. She never said anything outright harsh. She didn't need to. She let people fill in the blanks on their own, and they did every single time. I watched her for a while, not even angry at that point, just trying to understand how someone could make something so complicated sound so simple. It was efficient, I'll give her that. By the time the sun started to go down and people were lighting sparklers for the kids, the narrative felt settled, like it had always been that way. I was the one who couldn't handle things. I was the one who gave up. I was the one everyone felt quietly sorry for. At one point, one of my cousins tried to make conversation, asked me what I was doing these days, and before I could answer, someone else jumped in with a version of it that sounded suspiciously familiar. "She's just figuring things out right now," they said, with that same gentle tone people use when they're trying to be supportive without expecting much. I nodded, smiled, let it pass, because correcting it in that moment would have felt like arguing with a room full of people who all thought they were being kind. That's the part nobody warns you about. It's not always the obvious rejection that hurts the most. It's the quiet shift, the way people adjust how they see you without ever saying it directly. The way you go from being part of the group to being someone they talk about instead of to. By the time we left, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical effort. I helped my grandmother back into the car, made sure she was comfortable, and closed the door gently, like the noise might follow us if I didn't. I got into the driver's seat and sat there for a second before starting the engine, just letting the silence settle. My phone buzzed a few minutes into the drive. A message from my sister. "Mom's really upset," it said. "Why do you always have to make everything about yourself?" I read it twice, waiting for it to make sense, for there to be some part of the day I'd missed where I'd actually done something wrong. There wasn't. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't argued. I hadn't even finished a sentence. And somehow I was still the problem. I put my phone in the glove compartment and didn't respond because I was starting to understand that this wasn't about actions anymore. It was about perception, and my mother had already decided what mine would be. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, the kind that fills the car and makes everything feel heavier than it should. When we got back, I helped my grandmother inside, settled her into bed, went through the routine we'd built over the past few weeks, and then I sat alone at the kitchen table long after she'd fallen asleep. That was the moment it really hit me. Not just that my mother had told a different story, but that everyone had accepted it without question. Not because they were cruel, but because it was easier to believe something simple than to ask for something complicated. And somewhere between the barbecue and the drive home, I realized I wasn't just dealing with one person's version of events anymore. I was dealing with a room full of people who had already decided who I was, and I hadn't even been in the room when they made that decision. I was sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table with my laptop open and a half-finished cup of coffee going cold when I got the email that felt like the first real break I'd had in months, and for a minute I just stared at the screen to make sure I wasn't reading it wrong. Ridgeline Tech, a small software company in Hartford, had offered me an internship, and not one of those unpaid experience deals either. This was real structured, something I could build on. They didn't require a degree, just proof you could actually do the work, which at that point felt like someone had finally decided to judge me based on reality instead of whatever story had been circulating at family dinners. I remember reading the offer 3 times, checking the start date, the pay, the details, and then closing my laptop just to sit there for a second and let it land. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't some overnight success story, but it was a door opening. And after months of feeling like every path had narrowed down to one small room that mattered, I told my grandmother first. She was sitting in her chair by the window watching some daytime show she pretended not to care about, and when I read her the email, she didn't clap or make a big deal out of it. She just nodded once and said, "Good. That's what happens when you keep showing up." That was her style. No performance, just acknowledgement. I didn't tell my mother right away, and looking back, I think some part of me already knew why. But eventually I did, because there's still that instinct, even when it's not earned, to share good news with your family. I called her that evening, kept it simple, told her I'd been offered an internship and I'd be starting the following Monday. There was a pause, and then she said, "That's nice," in a tone that made it clear she didn't think it was anything more than that. No questions about the company, no curiosity about the role, just a polite acknowledgement, like I'd told her I bought a new pair of shoes. I should have taken that as a sign, but I didn't. I spent the rest of that week getting ready, organizing my schedule, figuring out how to balance being there for my grandmother and actually showing up to something that could move my life forward. It wasn't easy, but it felt possible, and that was enough. Friday afternoon, 3 days before I was supposed to start, my phone rang while I was at the grocery store, standing in the cleaning aisle, trying to decide between 2 brands of dish soap that probably did the exact same thing. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, because that's what you do when you're expecting follow-ups. "Hi, is this Ivy Colton?" a woman asked, and I recognized the voice immediately. Paula, the hiring manager. Her tone was different from when we'd spoken before. More formal, less warm. "Yes, this is Ivy." There was a brief pause, the kind that usually comes right before something you don't want to hear. "I'm calling about the internship," she said. "I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to rescind the offer." For a second, I thought I'd misheard her, like maybe the signal had cut out or my brain had just decided to skip over a word it didn't like. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though everything else in me had just dropped about 2 feet. "We've received some concerning information regarding your reliability," she said carefully, like she was choosing each word to avoid saying more than she had to, given that we can't move forward. I leaned against the shelf behind me because suddenly standing felt like more effort than it should. "What information?" I asked, even though I already felt the answer forming somewhere in the back of my mind. She hesitated just long enough to confirm it without actually saying it outright. "A family member contacted us," she said. "They expressed concerns that we take seriously." "I'm sorry, Ivy." That was it. No appeal, no discussion, just a closed door. I thanked her out of habit, hung up, and stood there in the aisle for a minute, staring at a row of identical bottles, like one of them might explain what just happened. And then it clicked, not slowly, not in pieces, but all at once. There was only one person who had both the motive and the information to do something like that. I didn't even finish shopping. I left the cart where it was and drove straight to my mother's house, the whole way there, running through the conversation in my head, trying to find any version of it where I was wrong. I couldn't. When I pulled into her driveway, she was on the front porch watering plants, like it was a normal afternoon, like nothing had just happened. I got out of the car, walked up the steps, and didn't bother with small talk. "Did you call my internship?" I asked. She didn't look surprised. That was the first thing I noticed. No confusion, no "what are you talking about," just a slight tilt of her head, like I'd asked something mildly inconvenient. "I don't know what you mean," she said, still holding the watering can like this was just another casual conversation. "Someone from my family called them," I said, keeping my voice controlled because I wasn't going to give her anything she could use against me. "They told the company I wasn't reliable. They rescinded the offer today." She set the watering can down slowly, wiped her hands on a towel, and looked at me with that same expression she used when she thought she was teaching me something. "Maybe they just didn't want you," she said. "Did you think about that? It was such a clean deflection, I almost admired it." "A family member called them," I repeated. "Who else would have done that?" She shrugged, a small dismissive movement that said everything without admitting anything. Not everyone is going to hand you opportunities, Ivy. Sometimes things don't work out. I stared at her, waiting for something, an acknowledgement, a crack in the performance, anything that suggested this was a misunderstanding. There was nothing. Just that calm, steady certainty that had been shaping the narrative for years. You knew about this, I said, and it wasn't really a question anymore. She picked up the watering can again, turned slightly away from me and said, I have a lot going on right now. I don't have time for this. Then she walked inside and closed the door like the conversation was over because she'd decided it was. I stood there on the porch longer than I should have, not because I expected her to come back out, but because I was trying to process how something that felt so personal to me could be treated like it was nothing. That was the moment the conflict stopped being theoretical. It wasn't just about how I was being talked about anymore, it was about what was being done behind the scenes to keep that story intact. I got back in my car, drove home, and sat at the kitchen table in the same chair I'd been in that morning when I thought things were finally starting to shift. My grandmother wheeled in a few minutes later, took one look at my face, and didn't ask what happened right away. She just waited. They rescinded the offer, I said finally. Someone called them. She nodded slowly like she'd expected that answer more than she wanted to. You know who she said. I didn't respond because I didn't need to. We both knew. And in that quiet kitchen, with the same coffee still sitting there untouched, something changed in me in a way that wasn't loud or dramatic. It was just clear. If someone could take something away from me that easily with a single phone call, then I couldn't afford to build anything that depended on being visible to them. Not yet. Not like this. I sat at that same kitchen table long after the internship fell apart, staring at a screen that now felt a lot smaller than it did a week ago, and that's when it really sank in that there wasn't going to be a clean recovery from this. Not the kind where you just apply somewhere else and move on, like nothing happened. I was 24, living in a studio apartment that barely qualified as one, with a radiator that clanked like it had a personal issue with me, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall close enough to remind you how stuck you were every time you opened the blinds. Rent was $650 a month, which sounds manageable until you realize everything else isn't. I picked up freelance work wherever I could find it. Small websites for local businesses, fixing broken booking systems, updating pages nobody had touched in years. $15 an hour most of the time. Maybe $20 if the client felt generous, which they usually didn't. It wasn't stable, it wasn't impressive, but it was something, and at that point, something was better than nothing. My grandmother's Social Security covered her rent, but not much else. Her medication alone cost more than most people would expect, and there's nothing like standing at a pharmacy counter, watching the total come up to remind you how quickly numbers can get out of control. I covered the difference every month without telling anyone, partly because there was no one to tell, and partly because I already knew how that conversation would go. Advice without help, concern without action. I didn't have the energy for that. My savings dropped steadily, not in big dramatic chunks, just a slow, consistent decline that you can't ignore, but also can't really stop. Every time I checked the balance, it felt like watching a countdown I hadn't agreed to. But the financial part wasn't even the worst of it. The worst part was what happened every time I stepped back into that family environment, because no matter how much work I was doing, no matter how much I was holding together behind the scenes, none of that existed in the version of me that had already accepted. Thanksgiving was the hardest. It came around like it always did, predictable, scheduled, impossible to avoid, without making it into another issue. And I went because my grandmother wanted to go, because she still believed in those gatherings in a way I didn't anymore. We'd get there, I'd help her inside, make sure she was comfortable, and then it would start. Not all at once, not loudly, just small things that added up faster than they should. Someone would ask what I was doing these days, and before I could answer, my mother would step in with something vague enough to sound polite, but empty enough to mean nothing. She's figuring things out, she'd say, with that same tone she used every year, like she was giving an update on a situation that hadn't improved. People would nod, make those understanding noises, and then move on because there's only so much you can say about someone you've already decided isn't going anywhere. Meanwhile, my sister would be sitting a few seats down talking about her career, her progress, her next step, and the contrast didn't need to be pointed out because it was obvious. My mother made sure of that. She didn't compare us directly. She didn't have to. She just highlighted one and minimized the other until the difference spoke for itself. I remember one year in particular, sitting there with a plate of food I barely touched, listening to a conversation about ambition and drive, and realizing I was the example of what happens when you don't have either, at least in their fat version of reality. Nobody said it like that, but it was there, sitting just under the surface of every comment, every glance. And the worst part was knowing that if I tried to explain, if I tried to correct any of it, it would come out sounding like an excuse, because that's what the narrative had already decided it was. So I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I understood that saying it wouldn't change anything in that room. That kind of silence does something to you over time. It doesn't break you all at once. It just wears you down in small, consistent ways, until you start to question whether any of what you're doing actually matters outside of the space you're doing it in. I'd go back to my apartment after those dinners, sit down at my laptop, and get back to work, because there wasn't another option, but there was always that moment before I started where everything felt heavier than it should. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just enough to make you wonder how long you can keep going like that. I wasn't waiting for someone to notice anymore. I wasn't expecting support, but I was starting to feel the cost of being the only person who knew the full version of my life. And still, every month the rent got paid, the prescriptions got filled, the work got done. No applause, no recognition, just consistency. If there's a version of rock bottom that doesn't look like a complete collapse, that's what it was. Not failing outright, not giving up, just existing in a space where nothing you did seemed to change how you were seen, and knowing that if you stopped, everything would fall apart in ways no one else would even be aware of. That's the part people don't talk about. Rock bottom isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and completely invisible to everyone except the person living in it. I closed my banking app after watching the balance drop again, and instead of panicking like I usually did, I just opened my laptop and pulled up the project I'd been quietly building at 2 a.m. for months, the one nobody knew about, because I'd stopped telling people what I was working on a long time ago. It started small, nothing ambitious on paper, just a logistics tool for small freight companies. Something I'd pieced together from freelance jobs and problems clients kept complaining about but didn't have time to fix properly. I didn't sit down one day and say I'm going to build a company. It didn't look like that. It looked like me sitting at a kitchen table at 1:17 a.m., the apartment quiet except for the radiator, doing its usual thing, watching lines of code stack up on a screen while my grandmother slept in the next room. I taught myself what I needed to know as I went. Python first, then JavaScript, then whatever else the project demanded. No classroom, no structure, just online courses, documentation, trial and error, and a lot of things not working the first time, or the second, or the third. But I kept showing up to it because it was the one place in my life where effort actually translated into progress without someone stepping in to rewrite the outcome. During the day, I was still doing freelance work, still managing bills, still handling everything that came with taking care of my grandmother, but at night it was different. At night, I wasn't reacting to problems. I was building something of my own. And that shift, even before anything external changed, mattered more than I realized at the time. The idea for the product came from a trucking company I'd done a small project for. The owner mentioned offhand that he was losing hours every week, tracking shipments manually, juggling spreadsheets, dealing with delays that could have been avoided if the system he used actually talked to itself. It wasn't a dramatic complaint. It was the kind of thing people accept as part of the job. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked a few more questions, looked at how they were managing things, and realized there was a gap that nobody had bothered to fix because the existing solutions were either too expensive or too complicated for smaller operations. So I started building something simpler. Not perfect, not polished, just functional. The first version barely held together, but it worked well enough to test. I gave it to that same company, asked them to use it for a week, and waited. When the owner called me back and said it saved him 10 hours in that first week alone, I didn't celebrate. I just wrote down everything that didn't work and started fixing it. That became the pattern. Build, test, fix, repeat. No announcement, no big reveal, just quiet, consistent progress. Somewhere in the middle of that, I made a decision that didn't feel dramatic in the moment, but changed everything that came after. I stopped waiting for permission. I stopped thinking of it as a side project and started treating it like something real. That meant paperwork. It meant choosing a name. It meant committing to something without knowing if it would pay off. I filed for an LLC on a random Tuesday morning between client calls, sitting in the same chair I'd been working in for months, and when it asked for the business name, I didn't use Colton. I used Parker, my grandmother's maiden name, Juniper Labs. It wasn't about hiding exactly, but it wasn't not about hiding either. It was about separating what I was building from the version of me that had already been labeled and limited. If someone was going to try to interfere again, I wasn't going to make it easy for them. When I told my grandmother, she didn't ask for a business plan or projections or any of the things people usually ask when they hear you're starting something. She just looked at me over her glasses and said, "About time." Then she handed me a check for $3,200, which I immediately tried to refuse because I knew exactly what that amount represented. It wasn't extra money. It was everything she had set aside. "I can't take this," I told her. She didn't argue. She just pushed it toward me and said, "I didn't raise you to be small." That was it. No long speech, no conditions. Just a statement that didn't leave much room for hesitation. So I took it. I used it to buy the equipment I needed, set up a basic server, and build the first real version of the platform in her spare bedroom, sitting on a folding chair that probably wasn't designed for 1-2-hour workdays. It wasn't glamorous. There were no late-night breakthrough moments where everything suddenly clicked. It was slow, repetitive, and sometimes frustrating enough to make you question why you started in the first place. But it was also steady. Every week something improved. Every month it got a little more stable, a little more useful. I drove to my first few clients myself, installed the software on their systems, walked them through how to use it, took notes on what confused them, what they liked, what they ignored. There was no marketing strategy, no polished pitch, just conversations and results. Word spread the way it usually does in industries like that, quietly through people talking to each other when something actually works. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I wasn't thinking about how this would look at a family dinner or how it would sound when someone asked what I did. I was focused on whether it worked, whether it helped, whether it could grow. That shift from reacting to what was being said about me to building something that existed regardless of it was the real turning point. Not the LLC filing, not the first client, not even the money. It was the moment I realized I didn't need to correct the narrative if I could outgrow it entirely. I didn't announce what I was doing. I didn't update anyone. I kept going to family gatherings, sitting in the same seat, hearing the same assumptions, and letting them exist without trying to fight them. Not because I agreed, but because I had somewhere else to put my energy now. Something that moved forward whether anyone acknowledged it or not. And the more I built, the less I felt like the version of me they talked about. That version needed their approval, their understanding, their recognition. The one I was becoming didn't. I stopped checking whether anyone believed in what I was doing and started measuring everything by whether it worked. And once I did that, things began to move faster than I expected, but still slower than anyone outside would ever imagine. The first year didn't look impressive from the outside, and honestly, it didn't feel impressive from the inside either. I had 3 clients, all small freight companies within driving distance, and I handled everything myself. Installations, updates, troubleshooting support calls at hours that made no sense if you valued sleep. Revenue came in, but not in a way that changed my life overnight. Around $48,000 by the end of the year, which sounds like a number until you subtract expenses, taxes, software costs, and everything else that quietly eats into it. What it did do was keep the lights on, cover my grandmother's medication, without me doing mental math at the pharmacy counter, and give me just enough room to reinvest back into the product. There was no safety net, no backup plan, just a system that worked slightly better every month because I kept fixing what broke. Year 2 was different, not because I suddenly figured everything out, but because other people started noticing, not through ads or marketing campaigns, but through conversations I wasn't part of. Truck drivers talking to dispatchers, dispatchers talking to other companies, small operators sharing tools that made their jobs easier. That kind of growth doesn't look flashy, but it's solid, and it doesn't disappear overnight because it's built on results instead of hype. By the middle of that year, I had 17 clients spread across a few states, and for the first time, I couldn't handle everything alone without something slipping. So I hired my first employee, a developer named Marcus, who worked remotely from Philadelphia. I remember the call where I offered him the job, sitting at my same kitchen table, wondering if I was making a mistake, because committing to paying someone else meant I couldn't afford to slow down. He didn't ask about my background. He didn't care that I didn't have a degree. He asked about the product, the roadmap, the problems we were solving, and that was the first time in a long time I felt like I was being evaluated on the right things. Revenue that year crossed 300,000. And while I still wasn't living like anyone would call successful, I moved out of the studio into a one-bedroom, got my grandmother a better wheelchair, the kind that didn't make every movement feel like a chore, and for a moment things felt stable in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not easy, not secure, but steady. Year 3 is where it shifted again, and this time it wasn't subtle. The client base expanded faster than I could track manually, new accounts coming in from states I'd never even visited, referrals stacking on top of each other in a way that forced me to start thinking about systems instead of just solutions. I hired more people, all remote, all focused on different parts of the platform, so I could stop being the bottleneck. 6 employees by the end of that year, each one handling a piece of what used to be entirely on me. The product improved not in small patches anymore, but in structured updates that actually scaled. Revenue crossed 2 million, and that number didn't feel real the first time I saw it on paper. Not because it was unbelievable, but because it didn't match the version of me that still existed in my family's conversations. To them, I was still the one figuring things out, still the cautionary example of what happens when you don't follow the expected path. And I let that version stay exactly where it was, because correcting it would have required exposing something I wasn't ready to risk. The less visible I was, the safer the company felt, and after what happened with the internship, I wasn't interested in testing that boundary again. Then the calls started coming in from people outside my immediate network, investors who had heard about what we were doing and wanted to understand how a company with no marketing presence was quietly taking over a niche market. The first time I got one of those calls, I almost ignored it, assuming it was another sales pitch or something I didn't have time for. But I answered, listened, and realized they were serious. They weren't interested in my story. They were interested in the numbers, the growth, the retention rates, the fact that we were solving a problem most larger companies had ignored because it wasn't big enough for them to prioritize. That's the advantage of starting small. You can move where others don't bother looking. A venture capital firm out of Boston reached out and asked if I was raising a round. I said no because I hadn't even considered it yet. They said they'd wait, which was the kind of response that makes you pause and reconsider what you thought you were building. Up until that point, I'd been focused on survival, on stability, on making sure nothing could be taken away as easily as that internship had been. But now there was something else on the table. Scale. Growth beyond what I could manage organically. I didn't jump into it immediately. I took my time, reviewed options, talked to people who understood that space better than I did, and when I finally decided to move forward, it wasn't because I needed validation. It was because it made sense for the business. The process wasn't dramatic. It was meetings, numbers, negotiations, terms that took time to understand and even longer to agree on. But when it closed, the company was valued in a way that would have sounded impossible 3 years earlier, when I was sitting in a studio apartment, wondering how to cover next month's expenses. And through all of it, I kept the same habits, same focus, same approach to building. No announcements to family, no updates at dinner tables, no attempt to rewrite the narrative they were comfortable with. Because by then, I understood something I hadn't before. Momentum doesn't come from proving people wrong. It comes from building something that makes being right irrelevant. I was going through invoices at the kitchen table when my grandmother called my name from her bedroom in that steady tone she used when something actually mattered, not urgent, not dramatic, just certain, and I closed the laptop and walked in. Knowing this wasn't about tea or the remote. She was sitting in her wheelchair by the closet with an old shoebox on her lap, the kind you keep long after the shoes are gone, because it ends up holding everything else that matters. "Close the door," she said, and that was new because she didn't usually ask for privacy in a house that small. I pulled up a chair and waited. She didn't rush it. She never did. She opened the box, moved aside a few photos and birthday cards, and handed me a single folded piece of paper like it weighed more than it looked. "Read it," she said. I unfolded it and saw the header first, my mother's email address, a date from years ago, and the subject line with my name spelled correctly, which somehow made it worse. I read the first sentence, then the second, and everything after that blurred just enough to make me read it again slower. It was an email to Ridgeline Tech, to the same hiring manager who had called me in the grocery store aisle, written in that careful tone my mother used when she wanted to sound reasonable. She said she was concerned that I had a history of unreliability, that she loved me but felt obligated to be honest so the company wouldn't be put in a difficult position. It was clean, polite, and devastatingly effective. No accusations that could be proven false, just enough doubt to make someone hesitate, and in a hiring decision, hesitation is all it takes. I lowered the paper and looked at my grandmother, trying to line up what I was holding with what I'd already suspected. "How long have you had this?" I asked. "Since the week it happened," she said, like it was nothing more than a fact. She used my computer and didn't sign out. I printed it before she could delete it. I let that sit for a second, the idea that the truth had been sitting in this house the entire time while I was trying to make sense of something that never added up. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, and I meant it. Not accusatory, just honest. Because if I'd had this back then, everything would have been different. She reached over and took my hand, her grip still firm enough to stop me from going too far down that thought. "Because you weren't ready," she said. "You would have taken this and run straight to her, and she would have turned it around on you before you got through the first sentence." I opened my mouth to argue, then closed it because I knew she wasn't wrong. I could picture it clearly, the confrontation, my voice too sharp, hers calm and controlled, the room tilting in her direction before I even finished explaining. "You needed to be standing on your own first," she continued. "Not just working, standing." She let go of my hand and nodded toward the paper. "Are you standing now?" I thought about the company, the clients, the employees who depended on decisions I made without second-guessing every step. I thought about the fact that if something went wrong now, it wouldn't be because someone else made a call behind my back. It would be because of something I did or didn't do. "Yeah," I said. "I am." She nodded once like that, confirmed something she'd already decided. "Then you hold on to it," she said. "You don't use it because you're angry. You don't use it to get even. You wait." I looked down at the email again, at the words that had quietly taken something from me, and then disappeared like they'd never existed. "Wait for what I asked." She leaned back slightly, eyes steady. "For the moment she tries to rewrite it in front of people who matter," she said. "That's when you show them the ink." It was such a simple way to put it, and somehow that made it hit harder. Not a plan to expose her, not a strategy to win, just a reminder that truth has its own timing if you don't rush it. I folded the paper carefully, more carefully than I needed to, and put it back in the box for a second before she stopped me. "Take it," she said. "Don't leave it here." I hesitated, then nodded and slid it into an envelope, something about not wanting it loose. Not wanting it to feel temporary. That night I took it back to my place and locked it in a small safe I kept for documents that mattered, not because I thought someone would come looking for it, but because it felt like something that needed to be kept intact until it had a reason to exist outside that drawer. For a while I told myself I might never use it, that I'd moved past needing it, that building something of my own had already answered whatever question that email raised. And most days, that was true. I went back to work, back to the routine, back to focusing on what was in front of me instead of what had already happened. But every now and then, usually late at night, when things were quiet and my brain decided to revisit conversations I'd already finished having, I'd think about it. Not in a way that made me angry, but in a way that reminded me how close everything had come to going a completely different direction. One message, one decision, one version of the story sent to the right person at the right time, and suddenly the path I thought I was on didn't exist anymore. That kind of realization doesn't leave you. It just settles somewhere in the background and changes how you move forward. I didn't confront my mother. I didn't bring it up at family gatherings or drop hints or try to force a reaction. I kept doing exactly what I'd been doing, building, growing, letting the version of me they were comfortable with stay exactly where it was. Because now I had something I hadn't had before, not just proof, but control over when and how that proof would be seen. And that changed the balance in a way that wasn't visible to anyone else, but I could feel it. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about catching her in a lie for the sake of it. It was about timing, about not wasting the truth in a moment where it would just get dismissed or twisted into something else. My grandmother understood that better than anyone. She didn't need to remind me again. She just watched the same way she always had, steady and patient, like she already knew how this would play out as long as I didn't rush it. And for the first time since that phone call in the grocery store, I wasn't thinking about what had been taken. I was thinking about when, and more importantly, if, it would actually matter to give it back. I set my phone face down on the table before dinner started and told myself I wasn't going to check it, not because I didn't care, but because I already knew what today was supposed to be, and I wasn't going to let anything pull me out of it too early. The house looked exactly the same as every other Thanksgiving. Same table stretched longer than it should be, same decorations my mother had clearly planned weeks in advance, same careful balance between effortless and I need you to notice. This 30 people, give or take, all moving through the space like they had assigned roles, and right at the center of it, my mother hosting, directing, controlling the flow of attention the way she always did. I walked in with my grandmother, helped her get settled, said hello to the same people I'd seen every year, and took my seat like nothing had changed. Because on the surface, nothing had. That was the point. Dinner started, conversations layered over each other. Plates passed around. The usual rhythm of a family that looked functional from the outside. Then my mother stood up with her glass and the room quieted the way it always did when she decided it should. She started with my sister, of course, highlighting her engagement, her career, everything that fit neatly into the version of success she liked to present. People smiled, nodded, clapped lightly. It was familiar, predictable. Then she shifted just slightly the way she always did when it was my turn, and I felt it before she said anything. "And Ivy," she said, tilting her head just enough to signal concern, without saying the word, "we're just grateful you're here." A few people gave me polite smiles, the kind that don't require a response. She continued, voice soft but clear enough to reach the far end of the table. She's still figuring things out. There it was. Same line, same delivery, same quiet positioning of me as the one who hadn't quite made it. Someone asked what I did, and before I could answer, she stepped in again, filling the space like she always had. She left college a few years ago, she said, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel like she was being discreet. It's been a journey. A couple of people laughed lightly, not at me but around me, because that's what you do when something feels awkward and you don't know how to respond. I didn't react, I didn't correct her. I just sat there, hands resting on the table, letting her finish. Because this was the moment my grandmother had told me to wait for. And right on cue, the next part came like she couldn't help herself. Later in the living room, she leaned in close to one of the guests and said something just loud enough for the surrounding people to hear. I sometimes wonder if Ivy dropped out because of mental health issues. That did it. Not because it was new, but because she said it like it was fact, like it had been confirmed somewhere I wasn't aware of. I set my cup down, walked over and said her name. "Mom, you need to stop." She looked up surprised in that controlled way she used when she wanted it to look like she hadn't expected confrontation. You were telling someone I have mental health issues," I said, keeping my voice level, not giving her anything to twist. "That's not concern." Her eyes shifted, searching for an angle. "And then," she said the line she'd been holding on to for years, the one that always reset the room in her favor. "If you had done something with your life, I wouldn't have to explain you to people." 30 people. Silence. That sentence landed exactly the way she intended it to. Final. Clean. The version of me she'd been presenting for years wrapped up in one line. And then everything changed, not because of anything I said, but because of something she couldn't control. Phones started buzzing. Not all at once, but enough to break the stillness. One person checked, then another, and I watched the shift move through the room in real time. Confusion first, then recognition, then something else I hadn't seen directed at me before. My uncle was the first to say my name quietly, like he wasn't sure if he should. "Ivy, is this you?" I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. By then at least half the room had their phones out, screens glowing, faces changing as they read the same thing. A headline, my name. Not the one they were used to hearing, but close enough. A photo, a company, numbers that didn't fit into the version of me they'd been given. My mother was the last to look. She took a phone from someone standing near her, glanced down, and I watched her expression move through stages I'd never seen on her face before. Confusion, then disbelief, and then something sharper, something closer to fear than anything else. "This isn't real," she said, but her voice didn't have the same control it had a minute ago. My uncle spoke up, not loud but clear enough. "It's on Forbes. It's real." The room shifted again, but this time it wasn't toward her, it was toward me. 30 people looking at me like they were trying to reconcile two completely different stories at the same time. My mother turned to me, searching for something she could still control. "You built a company worth this?" she asked, like the number itself was offensive. "Yes," I said. "Just that. No explanation, no build-up." She shook her head slightly. "And you didn't tell us that question might have worked a year ago. It might have landed the way she wanted it to." But in that moment, with everything else already in the room, it sounded different. "You never asked," I said. "You told people what I wasn't. You didn't care what I was building." Silence again, but not the same kind. This one didn't belong to her. My grandmother spoke next, calm and steady. She told them the truth. About the stroke. About why I left school. About everything that had been hidden behind the version my mother preferred. My father, who had spent years saying nothing, confirmed it in 2 sentences that carried more weight than anything he'd said before. And then I did the one thing I had waited years to do. I took out my phone, opened the photo I had kept for exactly this moment, and handed it to my uncle. He read it out loud. The email. The one my mother sent to Ridgeline Tech. The one that ended my internship before it even started. The words sounded different when someone else read them, stripped of context, stripped of tone, just facts on a page. When he finished, he didn't look at me. He looked at her. "You did this?" he asked. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The room had already moved past her version. And just like that, the narrative she had controlled for 7 years didn't just crack. It collapsed. I stepped out onto the front porch with my grandmother and closed the door behind us, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like something I had to carry alone. It just felt quiet in a normal way, like the air had finally reset after being stuck for too long. I didn't rush back inside, didn't feel the need to explain anything else or answer questions that suddenly showed up after 7 years of none, because I'd already said what needed to be said, and more importantly, I'd stopped saying things for people who had never really listened. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It unfolded over the next few days in ways that were almost more revealing than the moment itself. People started reaching out directly, not through my mother, not filtered, not translated, just simple messages that sounded a little awkward but real. My uncle called first, apologized in a way that didn't try to justify anything, just admitted he should have asked more questions instead of accepting the easiest version of the story. My cousin called and didn't even try to sound composed, just said he felt stupid for believing something without ever checking if it was true. Those conversations didn't fix anything overnight, but they did something more important. They broke the pattern. For the first time, people were coming to me instead of going through someone else, and that alone changed the dynamic more than any confrontation ever could. My mother didn't call. She sent an email instead, 4 sentences long, carefully worded, still trying to hold on to some version of control even in the middle of everything that had just happened. She said she understood my conditions, that she wasn't ready to meet all of them yet, but that she had scheduled an appointment with a therapist. That was it. No full apology, no attempt to rewrite what had already been exposed, just a small step that felt incomplete but for her was probably more than she had ever admitted before. I didn't respond right away because I wasn't interested in reacting out of habit anymore. That was the difference. Before I would have jumped in, tried to fix it, tried to make the situation more comfortable for everyone else. Now I was thinking about what I actually needed, not what would smooth things over in the moment. A few days later, my sister called. Not texted. Not sent something through someone else. She called directly. And her voice sounded different, like the version of her that had always been composed had finally dropped the script. She told me she knew about the internship call that she had known for years and said nothing because it was easier to stay in the role that worked for her than to question it and risk becoming the next target. She didn't defend herself, didn't ask for forgiveness, just said it out loud in a way that made it clear she understood what that silence had cost me. I didn't give her a clean answer because there wasn't one. I told her I heard her, that I needed time, and for once that felt like enough. The real shift didn't come from their reactions, though. It came from what I did next. I went back to my life without trying to reinsert myself into the version of family that had never really included me. I set boundaries that weren't dramatic, but were firm enough that they couldn't be ignored. I told my mother exactly what I needed if she wanted any kind of relationship moving forward. Not vague expectations, not emotional appeals, just clear conditions. Tell the truth to the people you lied to. Stop speaking for me. Get help not for me but for yourself. And if those things didn't happen, then neither would I. That wasn't punishment. It was structure. It was the first time I had built something in my personal life, the same way I built everything else, with clarity and intention instead of reaction. I moved forward with my work, expanded, the company relocated, built a life that didn't depend on whether or not I was accepted at a table that had never really had a seat for me in the first place. I brought my grandmother with me, made sure she had the care she needed without me carrying all of it alone, and for the first time in years, I started to feel something that wasn't tied to proving anything. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even relief exactly. It was stability. And healing didn't look like a big moment either. It looked like small, consistent changes. Sleeping without replaying conversations in my head. Answering the phone without bracing for what might be on the other end. Sitting at a table with people who actually knew me and realizing I didn't have to explain myself before I even spoke. That's the part nobody tells you. Healing isn't dramatic, it's quiet, and it shows up in places you didn't realize were still tense until they aren't anymore. I didn't walk away from my family completely, but I stopped carrying the responsibility of fixing something I didn't break. Some relationships are still there, different but real. Others are distant, and that's okay too. Not everything needs to be repaired to be understood. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that your worth doesn't change based on who recognizes it. It doesn't get smaller because someone else tells a better story about you. You don't need a room full of people to agree on your value for it to be real. I didn't build what I built to prove my mother wrong. I built it because it was the only space where the truth didn't need permission to exist. And if you're listening to this and something about it feels familiar, if you've ever been the one sitting quietly while someone else defines who you are, I want you to understand something simple. You don't have to argue your way out of that. You don't have to convince people who have already decided not to listen. You can step back, build something real, set boundaries that protect it, and let time do what arguments never will. Not everyone will come around. Some people will stay exactly where they are, holding on to a version of you that no longer exists. Let them. You're not responsible for updating their perspective. You're responsible for your own direction. And one day, whether they see it or not, the life you've built will speak clearly enough that it doesn't need translation. That's not revenge. That's just reality catching up. And if this story made you think about your own situation, your own boundaries, your own next step, then that's where it matters. Not in what happened back there, but in what you choose to do next.